Well, good evening and welcome back to the evening session of the conference. We have two sessions tonight. First of all, we have Paul Devereux, and then there is the panel discussion on the nature of energy. And at the same time or afterwards, there's a possibility of chatting to people who've been presenting posters and exhibitions. When I was putting this conference together, I felt that the Earth itself had to be represented in this spectrum of themes that we've been looking at over the weekend. So I naturally thought of Paul Devereux as someone who's been looking into this field for over 20 years. In fact, he's been the editor of the Lay Hunter since 1976. And he's the author of 13 books, including Places of Power, Symbolic Landscapes, Secrets of Ancient and Sacred Places, and soon a book which is being retitled. It's called The Healing Earth in Your Program, and actually it's going to be called Revisioning the Earth, and that'll be coming out in October this year from Simon & Schuster. And you'll see also that he's currently conducting a 7-year dreamwork experiment at selected ancient sites in conjunction with Stanley Krippner, who's a member of the Saybrook Institute. And he's been working with Bob Jahn on some extremely interesting experiments on the resonance of sacred sites. I don't know whether you're going to mention any of that tonight. Yes. That I think is really quite pioneering work, which Paul has been doing. So I can't think of anyone, as Peter would often say, better qualified to talk about the theme. I bet Peter's smiling in the other room. Can't think of anyone better qualified to talk tonight on this topic of the power of place from physical force to numinosity. And I should also say that Paul has flown in from New York. He now bilocates between Penzance and New York, and I don't know whether he manages this physically and non-physically, but he has come in from New York for the conference, and we're very grateful that he's come all this way to be with us. So, Paul, we're very much looking forward to what you have to say. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you hear me all right? Andy, can we have sound up? Is that better? Good. Excellent. Okay, well, thank you very much, David. Right. The theme of the conference this weekend is quite a tall order, it seems to me. The nature of energy, phase out. Science and the subtle. And when David very kindly invited me to speak, I got into a little bit of a tiz, because I thought, my God, what can I really say about this? I'm somebody that deals primarily with the cognitive aspects of place, and the cognitive aspects particularly of sacred place. And I thought perhaps I could do something about the subtle or something about energy. But then, lucky for us all, I suddenly realized I could actually talk about a spectrum from gross material energies through to the subtle non-material numinosity of things, because the study of ancient place provides a perfect vehicle for this, as it happens. And I should have instantly seen that. The reason for this is because the dealing with ancient sites and monuments and landscapes requires a systems approach. And this is based really on the fact that the word monument derives from the Latin to remember, or memory. And prehistoric monuments, particularly prehistoric monuments, are very much like memory banks in the landscape, very much like fossils of a form of consciousness that came before modern historical consciousness. And what I'll try to present this evening is the study of ancient places as a vehicle for consciousness study. This is not a familiar approach. I mean, we last talked about energy lines and all this stuff 18 years ago. And particularly for the last 5 to 8 years, we've been dealing with this as consciousness work. Far more sophisticated, far more fabulous and fantastic than late 60s, early 70s ideas of energy lines and all the rest of it. So it may be a little unfamiliar, but I hope to convince you, if you need convincing, by the end of the next hour and a quarter, that it is indeed a study of consciousness. And the basis for this is an analogy or a model that I use, that I always start off with to try to give the framework. And that is the analogy, which is really more of a dynamic than an analogy as such, that prehistory, if you like, is the analogy of the unconscious mind. And history is the analogy of the waking Western conscious mind. And the reason this is more than an analogy is because, of course, prehistory existed because of a certain range of consciousness. History arose because of a change in consciousness. And that's why prehistory and history do not have a chronology. So prehistory, for example, here in the British Isles, is at least, let's say, 1,500 years adrift of prehistory in the Americas. History and prehistory are the meeting of different types of consciousness. And so prehistory ended in the New World when the Europeans, the Old World, got there with a different frame of consciousness. And things started getting documented. That there was linear record, linear time, a different framing of the world view, as opposed to a softer, cyclical, seasonal, perhaps even in many cases a nomadic worldview, with the ego, the sense of self, much softer edged, merging much more with the environment. We're hard-edged, crisp and clear, so we think, so you wake up hazy and hazy in the morning, so you get sharp and clear as quickly as you can. Down that coffee, have a shower, all the rest of it, so you're awake and Western, first world consciousness. And you forget about the dreams of the night. Now, because of this, when you go to a Stonehenge or an ancient monument, whether it's a Native American power place, a Tibetan temple, a Greek temple, a stone circle out on a windswept moor or mountainside or whatever, when you encounter these places, it is the equivalent, literally dynamically the equivalent of trying to remember the fragments of a dream. Because this structure, this object, emerged out of another level range of consciousness, the equivalent of our unconscious. So the idea of a monument being that which calls to mind, its literal meaning, is literally true. It is a question of remembering, trying to put back together something that you encounter from your unconscious for a few moments. Try and remember your dreams of the night before as you awake and you go about your business of the morning hours. There's just this echo before it drops back into that vast ocean of the unconscious mind. It's the same when you encounter a prehistoric sacred monument in particular. Okay, back to systems. This is possible. This approach can only be systemic. And there are so many aspects to a sacred site or a monument or a sacred complex, a ritual landscape, from that other mind space that we call prehistory, that a one-dimensional approach really won't do. And I've made a little list here of just some of the different aspects to give you an idea of the collective that has to be addressed if you go monumenteering. First of all, there's the physical remains, the archaeology, the chronology, the timelines, and so on. Then there's the physical structure of the thing. What materials is this stone circle, this temple or whatever built from? How was it built? What are the proportions? And so on. What is the nature of the environment? The botanical and geophysical environment, as well as the actual physical topography of the surroundings. What are the visual and aesthetic aspects of the place? How does it visually affect you? How does it visually sit in the environment? How do the aesthetics affect you? I mean, the Temple of Luxor is very, very different at sunset. That big Egyptian sun sets over the Nile, and the monument, the ruins are turned to pink. There is an aestheticism there that has its effect on how you perceive the site, for example. Then there is the way that the particular site or monument relates to its surroundings, physical, topographical features, other monuments, other sacred places. In other words, its sacred geography. Then there may be ancient astronomical aspects, the orientation of the thing, the way it used beams of light from the sun and the moon or whatever. Then there'll be ground plan geometry, whether it's the ground plan of a temple complex or even of an apparently simple stone circle. There are geometrical elements in most of them. That in itself, the geometry itself, can encode arcane knowledge, which in turn leads to former cosmological worldviews and understandings. There can be the folklore and the myth that's become attached to a particular place. Maybe it's haunted, maybe fairies or hobgoblins appear there, or whatever it might be. Then there are the ritual and magico-religious aspects of these places. Many of them exist precisely because of those types of activity, which are not prime activities of the modern Western mind. And some of these places still have things happening at them. Some of them we could do without, others are more positive. And then I could probably double that list, but then we come to that, what David was talking about, that lovely word, numinosity. The feeling a place gives, the way it provokes your own spirituality and your spiritual resonance. And the sort of mindset that it evokes. And I'm a strong believer, using this dynamic, this image of unconsciousness equaling prehistory, that when you go to one of these places, a dialogue, a traffic of information can go on between the place and between your own unconscious mind. And that your little conscious Western self, who's taking the snapshots or whatever, is perhaps not aware of. What is it that draws people back by their millions to ancient places? Why is it the third recorded major reason for tourism? Why do we go back to touch base at these sort of places? Well, what is it? What's pulling us? We can't put it into words. But there's a dialogue going on. I hope to convince you by the end of the evening, well, my part of the evening, that indeed there may indeed be a dialogue going on, that there is a stimulation of information. It's an interesting thought anyway. Anyway, and so on and so forth with all this, as I say, the list. But it has to be a systems approach. Both our intuitive and analytical faculties are provoked by these places. Our intellect and our intuition, our visual senses, our haptic senses, our intuitive senses. Now, if we lock on to just one aspect, then our understanding of that place will become unbalanced, or at least incomplete. Too reductionist and analytical at one end, or too spacey and vibed out at the other to be of any use. And both polarizations are equally dangerous, in my view. Okay. Before we set about a lightning quick visual journey from the gross forces to the rarefied numinous, I would like to present to you for about 15 minutes some considerations I'd like you to keep in the back of your mind about the nature of place, particularly sacred place, but place in general, place as it affects us and our consciousness. And these are very important factors in any range of consciousness studies. I was reading one fellow who has written on schizophrenia. I can't remember his name off the top of my head. But he was saying, you know, nowhere in our psychology is there a place for place. He said, yet we do not live in a grey-toned vacuum. And really, I think the West has got to address this issue, as I'll try to explain. So first of all, a few thoughts about place. Our culture is monophasic. And that means one that is locked into one single, culturally accepted level or state of consciousness, and a single worldview which we insist is reality. Other ways of seeing the world, of relating to it, are remorselessly being eliminated from our view. We, in a broad cultural sense, I hasten to add, we are losing what Gregory Bateson called the news of difference. We need to add, or perhaps more accurately, to reacquire a mythic or imaginal dimension to our modern perceptions of the non-human natural environment. Our Western problem with place goes back, as many things do, I suppose, to ancient Greece, and, as I've indicated, to the cultural worldview reinforced by our 20th century psychology. And both these elements are conveniently captured in an anecdote, a true story, relating to the father of modern psychology, Sigmund Freud. And it relates to his first visit to the Acropolis in, I think, 1906. And Sigmund had struggled up the steep steps of the Propylaea at the Acropolis, excuse me, and he emerged out onto the hilltop, and that sort of blinding blue-white experience you get up there, and he staggered around a bit, and he had a weird experience. And how did he put it? He said he felt alienated. He had never understood, he said, 3 decades later, mind you, he had never understood what had happened to him, what he had felt there and then at that moment on the Acropolis. And he said that it had kept recurring to his mind. Standing there amongst these remnants of classical antiquity, these beautiful places, he had felt a curious alienation. Somehow he was not sure if he was present in a real place. And then, being Freud, he tracked it down. He said this odd feeling of estrangement had probably been triggered in his school days when he first learnt of the Acropolis. He realized that as a schoolboy he had never believed that he would ever visit this famous place. And a dissonance had been set up between his boyhood visualizations about the place and his actuality of being there. And this is an important factor we'll return to. But a place is created in here. A neuronal firing pattern of a place is actually created. If you've never been to, how many times do you hear people say, oh, I've seen these photographs of Stonehenge and I've always wanted to go to Stonehenge. And 9 times out of every 10, when they get to Stonehenge, they're a bit disappointed. Oh, it's not as big as I thought it was going to be, you know. Because they didn't know the total ambience of the place. They did not have the actual experience. A place had been neurologically, neuropsychologically, if you like, created. And he had this problem. He said, and I quote Freud, the original factor must have been a sense of some feeling of the unbelievable and the unreal in the situation at the moment. He said, the situation included myself, the Acropolis, and my perception of it. In other words, Freud experienced dislocation. Now this anecdote brings us to the deceptively simple question of what is a place? It sounds almost a nonsense question. It's not. In the growing monophasic mind state of our culture and times, we are encouraged to virtually dismiss, or certainly downgrade, ideas concerning the power of place. we are generally unconscious of place at any level other than the superficial one of it being a coordinate, an address, if you like. And as I've indicated, this mental habit can be traced back to ancient Greece, where a crucial switch in the development of the Western intellect took place, on many switches, as a matter of fact. The ancient Greeks had two words for two different senses of place. One word was kora, and the other was topos. Kora is the older of the two terms, and it was a holistic reference to place. Place as expressively potent, place as experience, place as a trigger to memory, a trigger to imagination, a trigger, if you like, to mythic presence. Topos, on the other hand, signified place in much the way we think of it nowadays. Simple location, the objective physical features of a locale, topography. Aristotle took this sense of place and abstracted it further into the pure concept of position. Ultimately, even sacred places became mere topoi. They were shorn of their mythic dimension. They were shorn of kora. In his Timaeus, Plato, as it were, on the cusp of the old mythic worldview, what we might call the new rationalist intellectual order, struggled to define the process of becoming aware of kora, of primeval space. He claimed that kora could not be apprehended by the senses alone. It could only be known in a kind of dream, or by dreaming with our eyes open, which is another understanding of the original Greek. Now, I think this is not metaphor but technique that Plato was referring to. What he was saying about a special kind of dreaming was, in effect, that we need to place a mythic filter over our perception if we are to experience kora, the imaginal qualities of place. It was Joseph Campbell who so succinctly equated dreaming and myth when he said, that our dreams are our private myths, but myths are public or tribal dreams. And the visionary poet William Blake could see the mythic in the mundane, in normal waking life. For he told us that double the vision was always with him. He said that a thistle across his way could simultaneously appear to him as an old man grey. ICRL, David mentioned Bob John, and he heads up this group called ICRL, a Consciousness Studies Research and Think Tank group, which I am a member also. And one of the things that I'm doing there at the moment, we started a 2 to 3 year program on lucid dreaming. And we are incorporating into this program of lucid dreaming the presence, the actuality of place as an element in it. Not been done as such before. And we're harking back to the method of loci. That is the old classical technique of memorizing things. So you've got a whole list of boring old things you've got to remember. So you visualize a place. It could be a house, or it could be a bay with a lot of islands in the bay, or whatever it might be. And then you visualize planting the various objects you've got to remember in each room of the house or on each island of the bay, or whatever it might be. There is a bizarre and curious link between place and memory and visualization, and there's a sort of a deep structure in the brain that sort of serves all this sort of thing. And we want to explore that deep structure through the means of lucid dreaming. Anyway, that's an aside. So in short, kora relates to an engaged, mythic or imaginal sense of place rather than a physical, utilitarian and mundane one. Our present disengagement from a soulful sense of place is leading us to the danger of no longer standing on meaningful ground. This danger has been interestingly considered by a researcher called Edmund Bunks of Delaware University. He feels that modern Westerners, especially in the United States, are beginning to display the symptoms of exile. He says, and I'm going to quote a few little pieces from him, "Where people work and how they live is increasingly being organized according to world market criteria. Global market forces, specifically consumer market forces, together with a global communications and information industry and postmodern cultural styles and forms, are squeezing out local culture, history, society, and nature." He says, places are either losing their identity or entirely new places are being created without a distinct identity. He goes on to refer to a corporate footprint on the land, in which shopping malls, office and high-tech complexes, warehouses, hotels and the like are packaged onto the landscape, and he states that people's internal lives may well be becoming as discontinuous with their environment as it is for classic exiles. Are we exiling ourselves from our own planet? Now, this estrangement from place is also projected back in time by our scholars. Very naughty of them. When they study ancient sites and landscapes, they send their own worldview back down the telescope of time. And a new and very lively branch of archaeology has recently arisen, that's why it's new, called cognitive archaeology. And it's trying to check this process. One young cognitive archaeologist, Julian Thomas, here at, not far away in Southampton, has written, and I quote, "Landscape is not a universal concept applied in the same way by all peoples at all times. The modern West has developed a particular and distinctive way of looking." He goes on to point out that prehistoric and non-Western art tends to depict place in terms of impression, feeling, significance, or meaning, rather than as outward appearance. Western art, since the Renaissance, has, to the contrary, been dominated by realistic depiction of surface appearance and the use of linear perspective, which is a form of visual control, which freezes time and distances the viewer outside of the picture. This, claims Thomas, heralded a way of seeing. The gaze has become the dominant mode of perception within our civilization. Thomas draws on the work of Susan Ford to suggest that we moderns characteristically look at a landscape through the medium of the male gaze. He warns that archaeology may be guilty of studying ancient landscapes in just such a manner. And this leads to typical Western approaches to studying landscapes involving distribution maps, air photos, satellite imagery, and so on, which all imply a considerable distance between subject and object. And, he suggests, presents a picture of past landscapes their inhabitants would not recognize. Another cognitive archaeologist, Christopher Tilley, also points out that it is frequently, usually, falsely assumed that there is no difference in our understanding of the environment, of space around us, from that had by prehistoric peoples. He stresses that earlier and non-Western peoples tend to experience the space around them as a medium rather than a container. He says how we experience the environment depends upon the somatic states of the body and the mental space of cognition and representation. Our present cultural worldview is increasingly seeing the land in terms of economic and social utility. Imaginative, expressive qualities of space are remorselessly marginalized. And this worldview can actually be seen growing historically through the development of the map. The mythic content in early cartographic essays was remorselessly pushed to the margins of the map, here be dragons, until literally the mythic finally fell off the map altogether. We are left with our clinically exact maps, which are certainly technical masterpieces, but bereft of the imaginal or mythic element. So, topography has replaced chorography. With modern technological power, the emerging monoculture is enforcing our socio-economic worldview with gathering speed and effectiveness. Soon, all news of difference will be gone, and we'll be living in Marshall McLuhan's long-prophesied global village. And that village will be built in our perceptual and cultural monophasic image. CNN will be everywhere. But it's not all bad news. There are sort of two strands of good news. One is that none of us really perceive places or experience places in the neutral manner good Westerners are supposed to do. Deep down, we are aware that we cannot actually think of a place without the elements of memory, imagination, and feeling becoming part of the informational model we build of it. A second item of good news, even though it might not seem like it to begin with, is that we never actually see the world, at least not as it is. Whatever the world is, we will never know. Physicists tell us that it is, quote, an n-dimensional energy soup. We only apprehend an informational model of the world, and that model is shaped by our own brain-mind processes, our culture, and our personal psychology. And it's very difficult to avoid the conceptual trap of thinking that we do, in fact, simply see the world as it is. I mean, I know I do it, I'm sure most of you do, most of the time. Not when you sit down and are intellectual about it, but as you buzz around your daily business. You think there's the world out there, all bright and shiny, and you're sitting inside that empty space in there, like a little homunculus sitting there in the dark, but looking out of these windows at the bright world and listening out through the doors and all the rest of it, so that that news of outside floods in. Well, of course, that's just a fable, a story that we tell ourselves. Really, well, in my case anyway, it's all solid in there, you know. There's bone and there's tissue and grey matter and other messy stuff in there, wall-to-wall solid. And the feeling we have of that little person sitting inside looking out, who's sitting inside the little person's head, you know, is a mirage. It is a culturally sustained phantasm. It's like that ghost speaker, you know, between the two stereo speakers. It's not there, but the sound coming from it. And I say culturally sustained because if you feel your seat of consciousness is not in here somewhere, just slightly above the eyebrows, in an inch or two, that's where you're supposed to be. If you're not there, if you feel that your consciousness has slipped to your left elbow or sidled into your cat or a doorknob or something, and if you are unwise enough to let on that this is the case, there will be doctors. And the doctors will put you right with the culture you're living in. We heard this morning that lovely phrase, the non-locality of consciousness. What a deceptive, quiet, and neutral phrase for a total paradigm-busting situation. If consciousness is non-local, every model of consciousness on which our culture is based is a false premise. And of course, what's happening with cognitive science, interesting, we have some wonderful cognitive science doing wonderful things with neurophysiology and neuropsychology and all the rest of it. But they're on a heavy-duty reductionist track. They are going to explain consciousness as a function of the brain. I wonder. Every time we look at it, I mean, one can accept what they're saying without accepting the premise or the conclusion they've already drawn precognitively before their studies are complete. But every time we look at anything, like a tree or whatever it might be, a raging torrent of information does indeed flood that visual signal of the tree or object that you think you're just simply looking at. Filter upon filter of memory, of connections, of associations, of reconstructed emotion is placed on your perception of the tree. And some of these you may become conscious of, but most will flash by outside the main focus of your central focus of awareness. We never see anything directly, as I say. The raw energies from the world at large, which enter our senses, are converted to electrochemical fluxes that process silently away in the darkness of our neural circuitry. We only ever receive a fabulous complex of processed information. Now, the data that stream into the brain and are processed there are constantly changing and developing, so countless models are always being made by the brain-mind. All that we can ever be aware of are these mental models. They are the only world we are ever in contact with. We draw these models out of the infinite possibilities that exist in the n-dimensional energy soup that we're part of, that it potentially contains. Even what seems to be stable three-dimensional space is, like time, a construction of our brain minds used to organize the data. And if you don't think that's true, then I openly invite you to change your consciousness by whatever means seems appropriate to you. And one of the first things you'll notice, I'm sure everybody here will have had the experience, that space starts to move about strangely, and things don't hang together quite the way they used to do. And time, similarly, starts distorting and moving around strangely on its own. Its sequence may change, it may drag out longer, or it may speed up very quickly, or in a peak experience, evaporate altogether. Following this sort of logic, then, we can therefore say that our idea of the Earth around us, the world at large, place, is but an informational model, which is dependent on the way our brain minds work and how the processing of that information is affected by the culture we are immersed in. Different people can receive the same sensory cues but construct a different cognition from them. Simple example, of course, the famous face vase illusion or the Necker cube and so on. But this dissonance can work on a grander scale also. So the worldview of, say, Western science, which is no more and no less than a particular cognitive model, differs from that of, say, a tribal shamanistic worldview, for example. It's the same world, but a different reading of it. Now, the good news in all this is that any informational model of the world can be changed. It takes a bit of an effort, because habitual patterns of thought are actually encoded in our brains in the form of primed neural pathways. To change such habitual neural firing patterns, we have to work at creating new pathways, neural pathways. So if we want to modify our cultural way of seeing the world, if we want to add a mythic element to our Western perception, which would result in an alteration of our relationship with the world, then we have to expose ourselves to different worldviews and ways of perceiving. The world, remember, happens here inside our brain minds. It's not out there. The world begins deep inside each one of us. It is not a given. It's not concrete out there. Okay. In the remaining time of this perception, of this presentation, I want to, as I say, could we have the lights down, please? I want to just flash through some different ways of looking at ancient places and go from what are gross or measurable energies and forces through to those which are not. And while we're doing it, I should point out that I normally talk for an hour or two on each one of these things, or even write whole books on them, that will flash by here in a matter of minutes. Don't worry, don't try and keep up. I'm just trying to give you a mosaic impression of the reality of this system, this breadth, the vehicle that ancient sites can offer. I'm really trying to say to you that the interaction and the engagement with ancient sacred place is one aspect, one chapter in the whole range of consciousness studies. And it's far more productive if we approach it in that manner. In my view, that's my opinion that I give you from years and years of experience and battery and whatever. We start off then with physical energies. And this work started back in the 1970s, especially with the old form of the Dragon Project, which is now doing consciousness work, but it started off with physical energies because there was a heavy rumor around that there were strange energies at stone circles and the like. So we thought we'd have a look at that. And most of the stories turned out to be fairly fantastical, but we did find out some things. And one of the things we found out was that at certain places we did pick up high-level natural radiation, not 3 Mile Island, not Chernobyl, nothing like that, but were higher than normal background. They were focused at certain places. And this was not supernatural. This was the result of two things, either because there were deposits under the ground where the site was located, or the materials of the site were themselves radioactive. Now, as you may or may not know, the granite is a radioactive material, and we were led by phenomenology, by people's experience. So, for example, we investigated Longleg and her daughters, the Great Stone Circle in Cumbria, and so because a gentleman, a government officer, set out for a walk around the circle one morning, and he went into a trance, went into a very strange mental state in the circle, and when he removed himself, he returned to normal. We hear about this, and we interviewed him, and we found out exactly where was he when that effect occurred. He said, well, I was near the, I think it was the north quadrant of the circle. It was near this, anyway, between these stones. We went and checked. Of course, the stones themselves are more radioactive than background because that's the nature of granite. It's putting out little electrons there. Or whatever. But small patches, the size perhaps of 50-pence pieces, various parts of these two stones where the man was when he had his experience were producing constant streams of gamma radiation that were well out into the environment around us, very localized. And again, presumably because of the material contained in the rock. But the scientists will say, well, what? I mean, this is low-level stuff. It's not really going to affect you. But I don't know. We had experiences on the Dragon Project of people who were, without their knowledge, at places that had high background levels of radiation, and we had numerous cases of short, sharp, profound altered states of consciousness, where the total perception of the existing reality was blotted out for perhaps 2 seconds with a completely different scene, or some element would be superposed on the actual environmental perception, and so on and so forth. And, sorry, I'm pressing the wrong. So I suspect there probably is a consciousness element here. Also, the waters of many healing holy wells here at Bath, for example, are radioactive. And bath has been measured and all the rest of it, and the waters there are definitely quite high. And we found this at a number of other places, and we wondered if perhaps the healing attributes of these places may have been due to, if you like, homeopathic doses of natural radiation. We don't know, but these are the sort of things that we found. I'm sorry, I keep pressing the wrong. We also found magnetic changes in the rocks. Some of this is pretty subtle stuff. Perhaps a 2-hour shift, ripples of low-level magnetism up and down a standing stone measured by Gauss meter or whatever. But then, again, because of somebody's experience that I'll come to in a moment, we started using good old-fashioned simple magnetic compass. And we found that some of the stones, almost invariably, at interesting points inside a monument, would move the compass needle. Again, it's not supernatural. It's presumably because of iron content or whatever in these rocks. But I think we should remember when these things were put up, the world was electromagnetically, if you like, quiet, and showed that a rock that had magnetism, which certainly can be directly sensed by the human organism by primary sensing, may have been more effective than it would be to us today, surrounded as we are by all sorts of stuff. My own view is, as we know from the rainforest peoples today, they have a profound and detailed knowledge of their botanical environment. My guess is that they also had a pretty shrewd knowledge of their geophysical environment. I think they're very sensitive to this stuff. We can't prove it. It's just a fact that we found these things. So compass needles would flicker needed places. This was a stone in Mitchell's Fold, a stone that was a witch, but she was turned into stone, and she's magnetic. But we got onto this particular tack or approach. Can't get the focus here. Andy, can we have the focus there? This is Carningley in the Preselles, thank you, in southwest Wales, and somebody had a strange experience here, and we went up there, and compass needles point south on the top of this, in fact. Full deflection. But it's called Carningley, the Hill of Angels, because a saint, St. Brunach, in the 5th, 6th century, went up there and had visions of angels, and he fasted up there, and it was a religious retreat mountain. And it is a fact that this is the very summit of Carningley, as a matter of fact. On one side, you see the north part of the needle is pointing in that direction, and on the other side, the north part of the needle is pointing in the other direction. And you can sit in completely divided magnetic fields. And it goes up into the air. It's not just at the rock surface. This is the part of the world, Preseli, where the blue stones of Stonehenge was supposed to have originated. So we thought, my God, now we understand why the blue stones were dragged all the way from South Wales and put down in the Salisbury Plain. And so we got there sure we had a real humdinger breakthrough here. And I got to tell you, there is not a square centimetre of magnetism in any of the blue stones. I thought, there goes my Nobel Prize. And we followed the same sort of thing. We looked at some Native American power places that were pointed out to us. This one, the Serpentine outcrop on Mount Tamalpais above San Francisco. You can sit here, it's beautiful, ergonomically comfortable rock. And your spine, the base of your spine, can be one magnetic field and your head in another. Quite intriguing. Okay, so that was those sort of things we found. Crude, gross energies that may or may not have been used. If they were used at all, in my view, it may have been for healing, but my guess would be it would have been to help play around with consciousness. If you sleep next to a magnetic rock, you will have different dreams than you will have if you sleep not against a magnetic rock. Another area of energies that is not quite the same category, it's another area really, but still we can say in physical energy terms, are curious light phenomena that the ancient places drew our attention to. and I call them Earth lights, and I've written a couple of books on these phenomena. This is a computer recreation of Castlereagh in Cumbria with curious balls of light. It's to illustrate an account that was reported in 1919 by an engineer, a man called T. Thington, who, with a friend, was coming down from walking up in the Lake District back to their hotel at night, passed a field with this stone circle in it, and saw large balls of white light moving slowly over the stones and in the vicinity of the circle. And they were moving one way and the other, not affected apparently by the wind. And then one of the balls of light detached itself from the others and rolled across, he said, at head height across the field towards where they were standing at the edge. He said it was about 6 feet across. And the light came up to within a few yards of them. It stopped, it shimmered, and he just went out, he said, without a sound, and they just ran like hell back to the hotel. Quick, stiff one. Time for a Jameson's. And so he wrote about it, and he said, could it be that this is some sort of natural phenomenon? And did the people put the stone circle up there because they've seen this and saw these things as sort of spirits or something? I still think that's a really good idea. And subsequently, we found many eyewitness accounts down the years of people seeing curious lights at various megalithic locations. And also, we were able to confirm that in China and India, temples had been specifically erected for the purposes of viewing strange lights. And sometimes they were dedicated, the temples were dedicated to the light phenomena. In China, for example, at Wu Tai Shan and Omai Shan, the lights are considered to be an expression of the Dharma of the Buddha, so everybody puts it in their own cosmology. Anyway, so we started this list of places and these lights and started looking at the lights. There was a good reason, I won't go into it now, I've got into it elsewhere, for thinking, associating the prime, not the total, but the prime occurrence of these lights with geological faulting, where there are unusual and interesting geophysical energy effects. We think now probably associated with certain meteorological phenomena as well. And we also found that stone circles and individual standing stones were highly correlated with geological faulting, where we could do really close testing. Other types of monuments did not correlate. And we got more and more into these types of phenomena, which do take us into a strange energy area. And fun enough, brings us to a matter that Peter was asked about earlier. This photograph is taken by a physicist in 1973 of a light form that was shooting along the Pinnacles Fault, which is about 4 miles from the San Andreas Fault in California. And he said he saw it shooting along at treetop height, and it was creating about 6 shock waves in the air ahead of it. He said it had mass. He said then it stopped without deceleration, which an object with mass cannot do. He said already I was looking at something that defied any physics as I knew it. When it stopped, it started to spin, and the light just dissolved into the atmosphere. And he took a photograph with his little box camera just as that process started. So we are dealing with something very odd, and the more we've gone into the study, the more we find that these light phenomena, they have a sort of on-off characteristic. They are associated, certainly they are of the same family as earthquake lights or ball lightning, but they are not the same. They have their own distinguishing characteristics. And they are definitely have geophysical attributes that we are not familiar with, and they have some that we are familiar with. But what we now think is that these lights possibly are, I'm really shooting for time here. I wanted to tell you a lovely story about this fellow at Nevern in Wales, who was followed by a little light that really put the wind up him. And the light seemed to react to him, to things that he did, which worried him even more. And he finally did get home that night, but other people saw this light, and everybody said, oh my God, what is it? And there was a bit of a local kerfuffle in the news media about it. But Evans Wentz had visited this particular village in 1908, and he said it was one of the prime areas for the Welsh tradition of the corpse candle, a curious ball of light, which the local mythology said would appear before somebody in the village died. So these lights sometimes seem to act with a very crude sort of intelligence or reaction. So what we've done on the ICRL also is to start trekking around places that have a record around the world of a high incidence of these types of light phenomena. And because these lights can be on-off, they can be seen sometimes from one side and not the other. They can have mass and no mass. They've got these curious characteristics. That one of our number, Hal Puthoff, who any physicists amongst you will know is working on zero-point energy, he said these characteristics are quantum characteristics, but this thing is macro-quantum. They're big things. Is it possible some sort of quantum effect is somehow being writ large in nature by mechanisms we simply do not understand? So we've been all over the place, like Marfa in southern Texas and places, and we set up and we studied them and tried to separate the wheat from the chaff. There's an awful lot of chaff. People see distant car lights 40 miles across the desert, think they're looking at UFOs. Now, this particular phenomenon has fallen between two stools. One is scientists who say, I won't deal with this sort of UFO rubbish at all. And the other stool are the ufologists. The people say these are extraterrestrial craft. Because of these two stools, this phenomenon has never been seriously studied until these last number of years, which is a great pity. Because, as I say, I'm pretty sure we are dealing with what is probably at heart a zero-point energy phenomenon. Peter was asked about the idea of sort of free energy and the cold fusion business. Well, it's beginning to look like the cold fusion is not an untrue effect, but a misdiagnosis of an effect. And it all relates to ZPE and so on. We think we're seeing it in nature, and if we are, then it'll be the stones, the monuments, that will have called our attention to it. Very poetic way of thinking. Recently we were in Australia, and we'd been picking up stories from white bushworkers in a very remote area. So we got there and started asking the Aborigines who don't now live in this uninhabited region, but they were able to tell us their experiences as children, as young men, when they did live there, where these lights can be seen, and so on. And so we headed out there, and we were out in pretty remote places for a couple of weeks, and we did photograph and record some light phenomena. We have various physical energy monitoring equipment and cameras, and it's a bloody uncomfortable place, you know, flies and so on, and a number of times I wondered really what I was doing there. But here's one of the lights. It's totally uninhabited, no roads or anything, nothing silly. And to see a light like that, you might have been there 3 nights, and there is no lights to be seen except natural light. So dark, in fact, that when a meteorite flashes over, you can actually see a sort of glowing coal after the bright trail has disappeared. Absolutely, I've never seen anything like it. But then suddenly a light like that will appear for 10 seconds or whatever and go out. Another light, I'm sorry, you really need total darkness here, and the slides aren't that good. They're slides of prints and so on. Thank you very much. But we traced one particular light. Went out. This is actually a nighttime shot, although it doesn't look like these are stars up here. And this was one particular light we were tracking. While we were doing that, we were getting geophysical readings of massive anomalies that coincided with the appearance of the lights and continued for about 5 hours after the lights themselves had gone out. And those results, those geophysical results, are now being analyzed by all the big tectonic people around the world and so on. With a little bit of luck, you'll be able to see this on Equinox or Discovery Channel in perhaps a year's time or thereabouts, because we were filming for that as well. So it may be that Earthlights will have their day, and we'll be looking, I think, at a whole new situation with energy. Maybe an energy situation for the future, because the potential for zero-point energy to provide a non-harmful energy base is quite incredible. But I don't want to get into that. Okay, so they're sort of physical energies. I'd now like to talk very briefly about what I call crossover energies, sort of visual and audio-visual aspects of ancient places, if you like. And one of these, David mentioned briefly, was the acoustical resonance work we've been doing at various sites. We just started doing this, and John, myself, Charlotte, and Brenda Dunn from the Princeton Laboratory, we went around a number of sites one pleasant summer a couple of years ago now, as a matter of fact, almost. And we checked the resonant frequencies of a range of stone chambers in southern England and in Ireland. This was Wayland's Smithy, and what would happen would be that the sound generator would be very exactly set frequency levels until we got the exact and precise resonant frequency, which could be measured, all the nodes and antinodes of the sound waves, standing waves back from the wall and all the rest of it. And we went to many different types of prehistoric monument. And it was a novel cognitive approach, if you like, to use sound. For example, these dolmens, like this one here in Cornwall, have often been noted, people have noticed that they resonated. They were great sound boxes. And some people have speculated about them being sort of musical instruments in some way. And when you got this thing humming, it was really humming, I've got to tell you. Then, as I say, we went to Ireland, we went to Loughcrew and checked some of the cairns there. This is Cairn L with this remarkable white stone freestanding inside the chamber. It's struck by a narrow beam of sunlight on one of the cross-quarter days. Marvellous exactitude with orientation. And then we went to the big boy itself, New Grange, and we checked the acoustical resonance of that. And of course we have, remember, you'll know that the rising midwinter sun shines down through the light box above the entrance to the 70-foot long passageway that leads into the central chamber. And we had that humming, and that is something else when New Grange is deep, resonant, at its resonant frequency. And we found that this long passage that the sunbeam comes in once a year was like a wind instrument. It was playing like a wind instrument. The acoustical frequency, resonant frequency that we found was 110 hertz. Actually, it ranged around that a few hertz. At every chamber we measured, even though there were different structures and different sizes. Now, that particular frequency is in the middle of the baritone range, male voice. And so I was unwise enough in the Lay Hunter Journal, where you can read all this stuff. Lay Hunter, by the way, if you haven't read it, you should. It's where this sort of information is coming out all the time. It's not coming out anywhere else in general readable areas, only in remote, obscure papers elsewhere. And I was unwise enough to say, well, this is the middle of the male vocal range, so Occam's razor suggests that it probably was to do, these chambers were used with male voices, male chanting, and so on. And the archaeo-feminists have really given me belaboring, because they say, correctly as it happens, well, it could have been perhaps instrumental music, could have been drums or something else. It doesn't have to have been the male voice. And that's true, but as I say, the simple explanation would be that empirically these ratios and sizes and proportions develop because of male vocal usage. We are going to extend this study to areas where we would suspect priestess or female vocal usage to have occurred. So I don't know what the archaeo-feminists will do then. To accept the new data, they'll have to accept that some sites were used by men. And this problem often occurs, that people want the past they would wish for rather than what the evidence suggests. Just got to go with what comes up. Another interesting possibility we've toyed around with, mentioned briefly in the official paper that's come out, So these stone dishes inside the great central chamber of New Grange, and one speculation, nobody knows, but one speculation is that it might have been filled with water into which hot balls of stone, which have also been found, were placed, creating big steam interiors inside these chambers. And there is some evidence that this method was indeed used in Ireland, even up until recent centuries, even up to last century. And if that was true, and if there was sort of chanting going on at the resonant frequency level, and then that beam of sunlight would shoot in, piercing like a laser this mist sweat lodge-like interior, you'd see patterns in the suspended droplets of water that look rather like these, which are the patterns that are actually carved on the walls of the chamber at New Grange. It's an interesting idea. It's just an idea, just a speculation, but a possibility. But that just neatly introduces me into another area, and this is the idea of what is an idea of? Oh yes, what the message of rock art has recently been telling us. A man called Waller has done some work at ancient prehistoric rock paintings. This is an example from Australia, and he's done it at various other sites, Lascaux, the caves of Lascaux, and so on in France. At the Aboriginal sites, he found that the standard echo effect from a rock wall was about 3 decibels, but using the same controlled sound source where the rock paintings were, there was usually about an 8 decibel return echo, if you like. And in particular, these are all painted in rock shelters where the walls curve like this. They're sort of like convex, sort of parabolic mirror sort of thing. And sometimes the sounds are focused in particular images in the rock art. And this is intriguing because it might mean the sort of a soundtrack goes with these pictures. At Lascaux, he was getting readings of 20 decibels and higher from the painted surfaces, but back to the 3 or 4 decibels from the unpainted surfaces. So rather interesting. Sound again. Now, sound and vision, audio-visual prehistoric style. But now there's another aspect and theories, and very good ones indeed, associated now with rock art as being evidence of being developments on entoptic patterns. That is, the patterns created in the mind, in the brain, in the cortex, in trance states. So when you go into particularly hallucinogenically generated trance, when you go into a trance, the sort of stage 1 level is geometric patterns of various sorts. These have identifiable form constant underpinnings that have now been separated out over about 40 years of neurophysiological work. And Lewis Williams and Thomas Dowson in South Africa, who've been studying Bushman rock art, put together the neurophysiology, psychology with the rock art they were studying and found evidence. For example, they would suggest that these sort of entoptic patterns, zigzaggy, wavy lines, became construal as they do in the second stage of trance. So a wiggly line might suddenly start appearing to you as a serpent, as a snake, or whatever. And they could develop into developed images. Now, the symbolic use of these things, of course, would vary from culture to culture. But the patterns are universal. They're common to the human visual cortex. They're characteristic firing patterns, phosphene patterns, a whole range of causes for these things. These are patterns from Fornox in Ireland. And there's been some very, very interesting recent work by Jeremy Dronefield on these patterns, in that they've done some very, very accurate measurements of patterns produced under epileptic fits, migraine, cannabis usage, psilocybin usage, peyote usage, and so on and so forth. And these different sources of trance effects, entoptic effects, all have their own signature or fingerprint. And they've now done a whole measure of 12 key sites in Ireland, and no sign of cannabis patterns or peyote or whatever. But there is signs of psilocybin patterns, and particularly of what's the word? Not migraine, some migraine patterns, but epilepsy, for various forms of epileptic patterns have been measured. And as this type of pathology of the brain occurs often in genetic groupings, usually down the maternal line, he's suggesting that perhaps this was a characteristic, what to us is a pathology or a disability, may have been a prized element in a shamanically based society. So this is work that's actually just breaking now, all this stuff. But suddenly we have a new way of looking into the monuments. These are just pictures of various rock art, Native American rock art. There's a guy called David Whitley doing fabulous work, because in America they also have the ethnology to go with the rock art. And it's clearly being designated as shamanic markings, as is the case with the Bushman rock art in southern Africa also. They can even now trace which stage of trance certain patterns and images emerge from. In southern Africa, and I can't pass this without further comment, there is the curious image of the trance or flying buck with a half human, half deer shape, apparently flying with streams of energy coming out behind it. This is the supernatural potency that the Bushmen refer to, that they encounter when they go into altars, usually as a result of their dancing, but they also use hallucinogens as well. And this is a depiction. We heard Joe talking about the dissociative state this morning. This is a depiction of the non-locality of consciousness. It's actually written on the rock walls for thousands of years. This is another Bushman piece of rock art, and that line off the top of the head is the sensation of leaving the body. It's drawn as a sensation. And these images have been staring at us down the ages. The whole question of the tunnel, entoptic, and so on, I won't go into that now. But this is the interior of Gavrinis, and they've now found the braziers that were used here in Gavrinis 4000 BC, contained opium. They took opium with the bones of the ancestors, and you have your entoptic patterns on the walls. The writing is on the wall. Okay, just to finish off sound and language really. The idea, we talked briefly, everything this evening is, of a deep structure in the brain, the brain-mind, prefer that, it's more inclusive, that underpins memory and it underpins language also and perception of place and so on and so forth. And the question that arises that we've forgotten, or the fact arises, ancient people had ears. And we had forgotten that for so long. We're primarily a visual culture. So you explain something complicated to me and I'll say, oh, I get the picture. Or, yeah, I see what you mean. Yet, I am hearing sound. Pressure waves are hitting my eardrum and I'm hearing something, but I say, I see what you mean. We are a very visual culture. But other cultures were not. So, for example, the Olmeda people in the rainforests of New Guinea might listen to a mountain, and their language is based on the sound of the mountain. What's the sound of a mountain? Something like that. Makes the sound of one hand clapping positively noisy. But to the Olmeda, the mountain is, they call it Sis. Ever heard the rain, precipitation falling on a rainforest canopy, which is the covering of their mountains, their ridges? Yes. The Kaluli people, also in New Guinea, similarly use the sounds in their environment as part of their language. The sound is actually integrated. If I can just find it momentarily. They, for example, the Kaluli listen to bird song in their rainforest environment, and they have poems and linguistics that relate to those bird songs. The bird song, the birds are defined by the sounds they made, not by their plumage or what they look like, because it is a close environment. They do not have the Western gaze. Their primary sense is acoustic. Alfred Gell here talks about going back to where he was 20 years ago, realizing he was trying to interpret culture visually. He's had to go back and interpret it acoustically. But there's a beautiful piece here. He's really writing about the work of a man called Feld with the Kaluli. Birdsong is not the only kind of sound which is thematic in Kaluli culture. The other very important source of acoustic coding of the environment is noise produced by watercourses and particularly waterfalls. The descending movement of Kaluli song is the sung equivalent of a waterfall. And particular streams and falls are perpetually evoked in the texts of Kaluli songs, which are typically journeys through the remembered forest in search of lost companions. Place, sound, and social memory are fused together in Kaluli practice. I just had to share that with you. I thought it was beautiful. I should just say, also not only listen to mountains, but go and have a conversation with a waterfall. Very good thing to do. And if you go to a waterfall, and you've all had this experience, you hear that rushing, roaring noise. It's a bit like radio static. It's technically a similar sort of sound. And if you listen into that sound for 10 minutes, 20 minutes, you'll start hearing things, voices particularly calling, and associations will be set up. So you are listening to the waterfall. And first of all, the waterfall will tell you its tone. It'll tell you about itself, and it will start telling you about the spirits that live there. And if you keep listening, you'll hear names being called, and there'll be names I know. Often, usually, it'll be the name or names of people known to you who have died. And the waterfall will start telling you about the spirits that you brought to that place. And this is a sort of mythic or imaginal interaction with place. If you can suspend that monophasic, rock-hard, ego-hard edge perception of the world that the mindset of our culture has developed. No time for this. I'll just flick through the pictures. We're going to do a whole thing on temple dreaming. No room for that. Dendera, that was. This is Epidaurus. And, of course, the idea of going to a particular place, having the healing dream and the divinatory dream. This is Corinth, where they use radioactive water, by the way. They brought that water 14 miles to the temple. They had a special sacred road, radioactive. And what's good about Corinth, it's still got the 3 of the stone beds in the Abaton there. Very comfortable, as you see. I was having a nice doze till a snake crawled over me, and I thought, oops. Which is also a sign of Aesculapius, of course. Right? That was fair enough. This is Lydney, where there was another dream temple in this country in Roman times. And the Dragon Project, again, that David mentioned, and I'll have to mention even less lengthily. We're conducting a dream project of 4 designated sites. In fact, 2 of the sites we've finished work now. We have sufficient dreams. And we've been doing dreams at these places to see if there's a geography of consciousness, to see if indeed there's such a thing as a resonance between the dreaming brain, the unconscious mind, and these prehistoric places. And indeed, Stanley Krippner at the Saybrook, he and his students are analysing the huge body of dreams that have now developed. But we're still working at Madron Well, a holy well here in Cornwall, and there's a session going on at that well. And yes, we finished here, Carningley, work going on there, so on and so forth. Okay. Do I have another 5 minutes? Marginally 5 minutes, 4 minutes. Can I have 4 minutes? Okay. Could we have the next one then, please, Andy? Just very briefly. We didn't start, till 7 minutes past. Never mind. I'll do what I've got to say. But don't count this time. Thank you so much. Okay, the other thing I was going to go on to then, that led us neatly and smoothly into dreaming and the idea of dreamscapes, that dreams could leave their monuments behind, if you like. Sorry? Yes, focus please. Could you just... That's good enough. Back again a little. That's yeah, okay. We'll live with it. The Paps of Arnu near Killarney in Ireland, the breasts of the Mother of the Gods, and you can see her form actually in the land. There's still pagan ceremonies under a thin veneer of Christianity going on there. Oh God. She will not go away. The Paps of Jura on the west coast of Scotland, linked by an umbilical cord of light on midsummer sunsets between the breasts. Important new stuff found out ritually and ceremonially there. Callanish, the old woman of the moors, who from different positions can be a maiden, or a pregnant maiden, or an old crone, depends which site you stand at. And the major standstill moon rises out of her vulva and sets in the Callanish stones. The sleeping Ute of on the border of Colorado and Utah. Another sleeping chieftain of the Apache in the Chisos Mountains. Important new findings in Egypt. Again, you can find this out in the issue of the lay hunter we have outside, because I haven't got time to explain now. Other than to say they've suddenly discovered behind the temple of Hatshepsut in the Valley of the Queen, the 800-foot rock face behind is in fact a heavily eroded statue group of the pharaoh with wig and beard, with a cobra rearing behind. They found the statues of this collection of imagery, but nobody knew it predated dynastic Egypt. This has not been published anywhere but the Lay Hunter yet. We had an interview with the Egyptologist Antti Donohue, who's made these astounding discoveries. They've now found that, for example, Min, who the Romans called Pan, actually has got his visage, his face is there on the huge rock outcrop into which a rock-cut temple is cut. The Sphinx is now found to have originally been a natural simulacrum like this, slightly aided and abetted by human artifice. This is another Sphinx with rock-cut temples, and also is associated in the local mythology. There's also small-scale cases like this in Scotland, in Germany too, an Odin figure that technical examination has shown is a natural feature that was enhanced by human work, was Christianized. So Odin hanging on the tree, the world tree, for the knowledge of the runes, became Christ with the wound in his side when the site was Christianized. There's also, we think, a goddess figure there, but that's got to be examined yet. Scully, working on early German work in Greece, pointed out these cleft peaks that overlook sites like Eleusis and the Acropolis and Knossos and so on, that is also an image of the goddess. Curious, ambiguous forms of the horns, raised arms, breasts, eyes, very curious range of stuff that was seen first in the landscape, monumentalized in the landscape. Most famous case of dream landscape, of course, is the Aboriginal dream journey, the so-called song lines or the footprints of the ancestors. Faces that emerge from stones and rocks at Avebury. People say it's just weathering, but who knows, the weathering may have actually depleted the likeness, the simulacra that may have existed there. And then, I don't know where I thought I was getting the time from, but I was going to give you a quick little story of my personal encounter with the mythic in Avebury when I sort of invoked the genius Loki or the Newman Loki in the Kennet Avenue. And I received instruction in a mythic imaginal sense from Silbury Hill, the great prehistoric mound at the heart of the great Avebury Neolithic complex. And hello, we've lost a picture. And anyway, so I had this interaction, and I received information at a mythic level that was actually translatable and is now mainstream archaeological information. Secrets about the complex that were 5,000 years old became back into consciousness, into our consciousness, because of the action, the mythic action of a site and a place. And I did want to show you a stunning photograph. I don't know what the hell's happened up there, but we were finally shown. I heard voices on top of Silbury Hill. It told me secrets. It told me that we were in the midst of a great and rich mystery. And then we saw this fabulous light coming out from the shadow of the hill right across the landscape. It was an optical phenomenon that nobody had seen. I photographed it. I can't show you for some reason. Andy, I don't know what the reason is. Anyway, so these were the crossover effects, the audio-visual. And finally, I was going to end up on Numinosity. Well, what can I say? What can I say? What I will say, just to finish off, last minute, the non-material power of place, let's use that word and not energies, the non-material power of a place is that word numinosity. It's coined by Rudolf, it was an adjective, numinous actually, coined by the noun. Joan mentioned it this morning, liminal. Place, a sacred place is. This is the nutshell, bottom line. It's a sacred place that is liminal. That is, it's between and between. You can have liminal time, like twilight. It's not night, it's not day. You can have a liminal state in your life. You live one form of life and you've not yet started another. Initiation is such a case. Pilgrim, the instance of liminal. Point where channels, if you like, are open between the and without topos. And my argument is that if we could get back to that perception, wrap it on to our current worldview, we would see a change in the Earth. Indeed, with that, the important problems of our energy usage of the Earth, I'm sure. I'm going to leave you with a short poem by A.A. Milne, which describes liminal place better than I think any academic has ever done. It's called Halfway Down from When We Were Very Young, written in 1924. He has Christopher Robin say, Halfway down the stairs is a stair where I sit. There isn't any other stair quite like it. I'm not at the bottom. I'm not at the top. So this is the stair where I always stop. Halfway up the stairs isn't up, and it isn't down. It isn't in the nursery, and it isn't in the town. And all sorts of funny thoughts run around my head. It isn't really anywhere. It's somewhere else instead. Thank you very much.
Wow. Come and take a seat. I'm sure you need to sit down as well after that. What a journey we have just made. Mind stretching, ear stretching, eye stretching. And you managed to put an enormous amount into time, which I think will sort of overflow our imaginations and help us, I think, re-perceive, because this seems to me part of what we're talking about this weekend. How do we re-perceive the world to enhance its meaning and significance, and therefore to change our relationship with it? That seems to be an important leitmotif of all the talks that we've had. I'm going to take one or two questions, because people must be bursting to ask things. And then I think we'll move on to the panel in about 6 or 7 minutes. With your permission, we're running a little behind time, but I think time is not that important when we've got such fascinating material to consider. Peter, any comments from you personally on the presentation? Because there was quite a lot of neuro, this, that, and the next thing, and relationships between pathways, perceptions, and so forth.
A lot of neuro, this, that, and the next thing. And some wonderful questions which come out of it. I don't expect an answer, I'll just raise it as a question. And the question really is, if we have these fundamental patterns which are part of all cultures, is that something which is the basis of our understanding of nature? Is that the basic consciousness of the world? Is that the fundamental given? Or is it something which we have to go beyond and transcend? So it's really just a question.
Well, Peter, I think I asked a friend of mine, a colleague, James Cowan, the fellow who writes wonderful stuff about the Australian Aborigine, who's living with them now, has done for many years on and off. And we debated, again, the debate was in the Lay Hunter, but we debated whether, given a landscape, if the people who lived there, the Aborigines who lived there, moved away, and perhaps 100 years later, another group of people of a similar technological development lived in it, are we looking, as our Western reductionists would say, simply the projection of ideas onto forms in the landscape? Or are we also looking perhaps at a landscape, the forms in a landscape, actually imprinting themselves into the cognitive processes of the people who live in that landscape? And I think it's a two-way, and he did too. We both felt it was a two-way thing, and that the same sort of myths, although different names and different symbolisms might emerge, the same fundamental myths about that curiously shaped mountain peak would emerge in the mythology of the new people that came in. So that there is a traffic, there is an actual communication from landscape and place into the minds of people who live there. So what is happening to our culture where we no longer live as a culture in a natural environment?
Yes, and even if those of you who know Barbara Hepworth's museum in St Ives will perhaps remember that that she talks about the influence of her landscape on her sculptures, and so that she internalized the landscape and then re-expressed it in her art. I found that a fascinating idea. A question or comment from here? Who would like to? John.
John Hunt, Paul. I just have a question about the place in dreams, going back to what you said earlier. From my own experience, and I don't know whether it's a common experience and everybody may have it, but I think in my experience, all the dreams that let's say most of the dreams that I remember, I have an element of my home, the place where I was born, some element, and I think it's probably 100% of my dreams that are actually, if I could identify it and remember it, there'd be an element of where I was born. Yeah. But certainly most of the dreams that I remember, there's the place, often the people, but certainly the place. And I wonder how common that is, and whether you've had that experience. I don't think I've had any particular trauma at childhood to make me, have a fear of it or whatever. It seems very natural and just appears very naturally as a sort of background painting, to the dreams.
Yes, it is usually a background, and that's what really is being suggested now, that we focus on that background in dreams more, because place does appear. Often in your old school, often can appear in a dream in slightly distorted or changed ways, or the place where you live. I mean, you move perhaps from one house to another, one apartment to another. And the trick is, you see, that first of all, you live in a place. Then you move on and the place lives in you. And it is still living in you, as the dreams will every so often throw up. So what is this relationship? And what is the modeling that's going on here? And if we understand that modeling, remember, there is no space. There is no place. It's a model. I can change that model for you, given certain circumstances. And so we are dealing only with a model of consciousness. And the dreams have these fragments in that are not really considered. It's not considered by our psychologists, or except in very rare extenuating circumstances. So I agree with you. They are there. It'd be nice to bring them into the foreground for a change.
Thank you. Peter, do you have a question from the Arts Centre?
Yes, I do.
Is working?
No, not yet. This is the chairman of the trustees who's about to address a question.
It's nearly working.
No, he's still disembodied. Max, come and take this one.
The name is Max Bain. I'm fascinated with what you say, but what I want to know is, are you a complete relativist? And if not, why not? What I mean is, with all these models that our brains can construct, and I take what you say totally, is there any model which is superior in any way to any other model? Can we, for instance, distinguish between sanity and madness, or is that a purely arbitrary distinction by block vote? Are all models fundamentally equal, or is there a meta-model of choice of model?
I think there's theory and practice in the answer to that. In theory, I think all models are equal, but I think in practice, wherever you exist as a person, you will be in a cultural framework of some kind. And therefore, it is not equal, if you like, to have certain models in certain cultural frameworks. It does not help you get around the supermarket or drive the car if you get excessively mythic about it. You do not want your airline pilot halfway across the Atlantic to get mythic. So it's horses for courses, really, I think. But I think in theory, yes. I mean, what's special about one model to another? Its application, I think, in its context.
There's also the question of levels, isn't there? And how adequate and how complete a particular model claims to be. Because if a shamanic worldview is not a neural model, and equally a neural model which reduces everything to a localized form of consciousness, it may think it's complete, but actually it isn't.
Yes.
Or we don't think it is.
The question for us, I think, is the fact, are the models we're using. And don't forget that the trick about us, our tribe, is that we're having more effect on the world than any other tribe before it. And as a consequence, it's very important that we find out about our models, because they will have total effect. And so therefore, if our modelling is incomplete, we really ought to find out about that. So if there are such things as aura fields around the human being, let's know about it. Let's not say that they're not there if they are there, if we can model that in. Just a very brief example, but the German anthropologist Christian Rech went to live with Mayan Indians in southern Mexico for 3 years. And after about 6 months there, he started seeing things in the forest that his German self would not have seen. Trees and parrots and things that were not there in the Western sense. He said, but they were there fully to me at the time. And when he mentioned this to the village people, they just fell about laughing. You know, it's the jungle spirits playing tricks on you. It happens all the time. That was the explanation.
Could I come back on that a minute?
Sure.
Could I suggest that you, like me, and everybody else in this audience, actually have a meta model which makes us different? I think that's half your point. I mean, your Mayan Indians or your Australian Aborigines have their particular model. And until they are broken down by contact with Western civilization, which is a destructive relationship between models, they only got that model. You and I sit back and know there are different models, and know it in a sense at a higher level. So we're in this meta-model state, are we not?
In that sense, we are, because we are what we call conscious about it. It's the same way these dream images in the landscape. We say, oh, look, that hill looks like a pair of breasts or a chieftain's face or whatever it is. But we say that it looks like. We say, oh, I had a dream about so-and-so last night. Silly dream, you can't believe what he was wearing or whatever. But when you're having the dream, you don't make that sort of comparison or connection. And what I would suggest, the people who lived in these mythologized landscapes were not awake. They weren't asleep. They could still do things, you know. But they were not awake in the sense that we are. So I agree there that we have a meta. But are we awake from our dream? I don't think so.
Yeah, it's Charles Jessel. I think this will have to be the last specific question, but other ones can come up in the panel.
You mentioned the meaning of monument had to do with memory, and we people who believe that water has a memory, do you see connection between these sites and water, underground water, springs, and various other types of water? Do you think that is very significant?
Well, all I can say in answer to that is that in a book many years ago now called Earth Mind, I speculated wildly on that very topic. And I can do no more than speculate, but my gut instinct is to say, yeah, I think there's something there. But once we understand what the memory of water is and what it means, we perhaps could answer that question a bit better.
Well, Paul, thank you very much for, as I said, an extraordinarily rich presentation, and which I think has certainly for me has put me back in contact with very, very consciously with different levels or layers of myself, and also in relationships to places that I've either been to that you saw, or places that I've associated with the images that you gave out. And I think the acoustic work you're doing is extremely exciting and very novel, and the lucid dream work, I can't wait to hear more about the results.
Neither can we.
And it seems that if we can legitimize a participatory science like this, which I think is one of an aspect of what you're doing.
It's emerging.
I think we're emerging into a participatory worldview, and this is a participatory science in which you can't just appreciate and understand things by looking at them with the masculine gaze, as you suggested. That only a very small aspect of it will emerge, where if you still retain your what I might call a sort of objectivity of perception about your own perceptions or own presuppositions. I think if you can retain that slight distance in your participation, then you may come to new insights about the natural world, about yourself, and about our relationship with the natural world. So thank you very much for sharing that very rich experience with us.
Thank you very much. Rather than having a theoretical discussion about what is energy, I think I'd like to turn to our previous speakers and future speakers and ask them to go back to the sort of actual experience that they've been sharing with us. They all have specific experiences of healing, of what it is like to be in these places, and to ask them what is it about this particular experience which they feel is appropriate to use the word energy to describe. Why, in fact, are all our speakers using the word energy to talk about their experience? Well, the answer to that is probably because David asked them to do that. But maybe there's some deeper reason lying behind it, other than the fact that that's just what they were told to do. Whenever we get to this question of why do you use the word energy, I think we tend to fall between two possibilities. One is to start tagging the word energy onto absolutely everything, so that it then starts to mean nothing. And the other problem is getting completely hung up on a physicist's conception of energy and always trying to relate what you're talking about to a physicist's conception of energy. And when I say a physicist's conception of energy, usually and fairly recently it's been the sort of concept physicists had of energy around about the 1930s. Now it tends to be the sort of concept that quantum mechanics people have of energy around about the 1960s. And I'd like to start off with just spending 5 minutes or so in a way blowing these ideas open a bit and saying well, there are all sorts of other things that energy might mean, other sorts of models of energy. Then having just used that to stir up ideas a bit, to go back to the panelists and say, well, having stirred up our ideas, go back to your experience, back to what you were talking about. Why is energy an appropriate thing, an appropriate word to use in this context? Is it the case that we're dealing with analogies, as Bill suggested to us in the first lecture, or is it the case that there is one thing of which comes in a variety of forms? What I want to do in order to stir up ideas is to look at the word energy, because I think words are not just arbitrary sounds. Words have a life of their own, roll along rather like snowballs, gathering up ideas around them as they roll forward. And so I want to look at some of the ideas that the word energy has rolled up in itself. I'll then go back to our panelists. So I've got here a little list of some of the senses that energy has rolled through in the course of time. And I'll just rapidly talk through this and then sit down. Originally, energy, energeia, was well, not originally, but if I start off with Aristotle, energeia was a pure act. There was a dichotomy between energeia and dunamis, power and energy was the completed act in juxtaposition to dunamis, power. And then after that, in the early Platonists, it moved into energeiae from the plural, the actions of God in the world, the seeds which were sent out by God into the world. And that was held alongside the idea of energeia as a sort of potentiality for action, as a seed of God which could then flow into God. And that became actually the dominant use of the word energy in the Middle Ages. Through the writings of the pseudo-Denis, energy was part of a triple of ousia, dunamis, energeia, being, power, energy. The being of God, the power which flowed out from God, the energeia, which was the return back to God, carrying back the acts of God back to the One. And that was the basic concept of energy for sort of 500 years in the early and late antiquity, early Middle Ages. And then the word sort of faded out a bit after that, until the scientists got hold of it, the physicists got hold of it, and energy became a numerically conserved quantity, something quite different. It was something which you could measure, and you could convert it from one form to another, but in this conversion, the quantity was always conserved. And that idea of conservation was basic to that idea. And so that idea carried on for a little bit. Then tacked alongside it
came the idea of energy as the Hamiltonian. This was late 18th century, where energy in the mathematical context of Hamiltonian dynamics became not a conserved quantity, but the quantity which actually specified how the dynamics unfolded. So it became a specification of the flow of the dynamics. Then special relativity came along, and there was a fairly short period where energy was thought of as the basic stuff of the universe. Everything was energy. It was fairly soon realized that this was a fundamental misconception. It was negated by general relativity, in which energy is not conserved, and B, you can't really regard energy as a fundamental substratum if its quantity is different according to which observer you are. So that idea faded out. Again, in parallel with that, then energy started being used in a sort of pneumatic sense, in the sense of human energy, the energy of the body. And many Western psychologists, particularly physiologists, particularly those who incorporated Eastern ideas, started using energy as a means of encoding pneuma, chi, and so on. And then that idea itself turned into a sort of concept of energy as potentiality for action or change. When you say that you've got lots of energy, what you mean, in fact, is that you have a great capacity for doing things. So we have all these different sorts of energy. And just coming back to that last one about the idea of energy as a vital force or chi or whatever, we ought to remember there that in the traditions from which that idea is borrowed, energy is very often quite a complex quantity. In the case of some Chinese systems, you have the idea of qi being continually changed into shen, spiritual energy. So there are many different models around, many different ideas, and we don't have to fixate on physical energy, we don't have to fixate on what quantum theory thought that energy was in 1960. Let's just go back to our ideas, our experience, and say, well, what was it that we were experiencing, and what might this have in common with what some other people were experiencing? So at that point, I'd like to stop talking and sit down and ask our speakers to reflect on that. And maybe I'm not quite sure what the best way to do this is. Let me first of all sit down. I think I'll make it a free for all if I can get in, and just ask people to come in as best they will to shed some light on what it might be that people are talking about when they use the word energy. Who'd like to start? Any volunteers? You want to go off?
You're looking at me, Chris. I may
You
as well.
have to be near it.
Right. Can everyone hear me? Well, I think your question was, how did, in a way, what sort of experience did we have that we could relate to as energy? Well, I don't want to take up too much time talking about my own particular window when I was a child, which is still true now, but has different dimensions to it. But I actually have always felt of energy as vibrating fields of information. It took me years to apply the word energy to what I've always seen as a multifaceted, very complex vibrational world, whether it's a human being that I'm looking at or the relationship between that human being and another, or the vibrational fields that underlie and are part of, in a sense, and also are behind, like blueprints of information, any sort of form in nature. And even more powerfully, when we're talking about the wonderful sites that Paul Devereux was speaking about, which I found extremely inspiring and really gave us a chance to reconnect, as David said, with that wonderful energy or power of the beautiful planet we live on. So for me, it's always been a very personal experience of vibrational fields of information. And I know when Chris faxed me last week and said, quick sentence on energy, and I wrote back something like, I think we're journeying in the divine mind. I think that everything is a vibrational field of energy that's basically information. I think it wasn't quite the sort of answer you wanted from me. But that really is how I see it. Yes.
That's quite a good concrete model. Does anyone else respond to that? Does it key in with what other people? Yeah.
Well, I mean, I've been trying to think. There seemed to be a distinction between energy and force, fields, you know, that which is a different thing, and then there's information. And we often tend to sort of throw them all into the same. If there's a kind of field around something, you know, then so it's sort of there, but it's not there, sort of thing. You know, you can, like a magnetic field or something. You tend to think of magnetism as a form of energy, where the field isn't really a form of energy in the strict sense. Well, it sort of is, but I'm not quite sure about that. I need to get my mind a bit clearer. And then there's if you get information or signals or something like that, then of course there's got to be an energy carrier. But the essence of it is modulated energy, really. It's the modulation, it's the information that's the significant thing, although, of course, it's got to have some energy in it. And I think that was something you put them all in one sentence, essentially.
So we seem to be homing in, actually, on information, a field of information, as perhaps one of the key things. Does that key in with sort of what you were saying about sight? That seems a bit like it, doesn't it?
Yes, the idea that all that we ever are, all that we are really ever aware of is information. Then the question is, what is information? And does that actually need any physical carrier? And the answer is no, it doesn't. I just feel the whole question, I think what you were saying actually in the introduction is true. We've overused the word energy quite a lot. I mean, like if you think of something like feng shui, the Chinese divinatory system, we're full of qi and full of that, but really the system of feng shui developed from ancestor worship, and it was to do with spirits. And so an equally complex word is the word spirit. What does that mean, you see? And then we might say, what's the sort of energy effect today? I mean, I think the word, in the end, is non-definable. What I do feel happens is that people use the word energy now when they might mean something more akin to numinosity. To a non-material sense of something. And I think that can confuse issues quite a lot. But ultimately, you come down to mind stuff, consciousness. I mean, the bottom underneath this question that's been raised is the question of consciousness itself. What is it? I use the word energies because I was told to, you know. What's the theme? But it was, I think consciousness, spirit, energy, I think we have to try to understand what we mean by these glosses. That's what they really are. They are glosses for something that I don't think we have actually a language for.
Yeah, we're trying.
I would like to add to that. Can you hear me? Is my energy transferring over to you in the form of my voice? I think it is an extremely difficult word to define. That will keep us using our energy for some time to try and define it, endlessly probably, and as our chairman has already indicated, there have been historical, and Paul has also indicated, cultural definitions and changes in what we mean about it. I think we could, at a purely pragmatic level, probably say that it does belong to power and to force, especially in the animal, vegetable and mineral dimensions, but there has always been that other indefinable aspect of human nature. I say human nature, but I think also possibly animal, maybe insect nature, for all we know, that has not only energy but possibly a spiritual attachment, a spiritual force, a spiritual identity. Certainly energy, as I understand it, tends to ebb and flow, just as the tides ebb and flow on the magnetic force. The seasons come and go, and it is the reason why some of us have left this auditorium and others of us remain, because some of us have enough energy to keep going and others of us do not. It all has an attachment, it has an individuality, and yet it is all pervasive. It also has a harnessing factor which man can either use for good or for bad. We can use, for example, the tremendous force of electricity for our benefit, but we can also use it to ignite rockets and other harmful potentials, the like of which I think we do not always comprehend. Indeed, as we move in more and more into the technological age and into the age of quantum physics, our ability to use our energy energies to measure the infinite becomes greater and greater, and with it greater responsibility, which I fear we do not always comprehend or are willing to take on.
Can I sort of tease out some of those ideas? Because part of...
Not sure I've got the energy to do that.
I mean, that's a good illustration, I think, of one use of energy, of a sort of fuel, a sort of psychic fuel that keeps you going. And when your fuel tanks are low, then we want to...
the defences are down.
We
were talking, or perhaps I should correct that and say I was doing most of the talking today, which wasn't fair in the workshop, about how draining dowsing can be, as distinct from healing, which possibly, although everybody will have their own individual experience of this, but in healing, energy can often come from you or through you, and the distinction, as healers in this hall may or may not agree, is crucial as to the amount of work you do. Whereas in dowsing, you're normally using the self and other awareness, but certainly a physical energy as well, if only because you're holding your tummy because it's vibrating madly over one of Paul's rocks, or because you are holding the rod in such a level of tension that you can't keep the wretched thing up for too long. But there are other factors of consciousness which I think demand different types of energy, but nevertheless it is the consumption of this elusive word, and it is important, I think, always to rest as well as to exercise that energy. I don't know if anybody in the hall would agree with that, but it's also, I think, significant that in psychic work, the ability to protect and to have enough energy for yourself as well as for helping others is equally significant. And I remember in one talk I gave to, I think it was a group of medical people, where the emphasis was on the healer, the person who was doing the energy, the giving of the energy, being as fit and as well and looking after themselves first. That was the critical point. And somebody in the audience said, surely you're not saying that the healer should be looking after themselves. It is the patient or the person that they're trying to help that should be looked after first. But the point that was being made was that the healer needs to have the energy to be fit, well, rested, so that they are as good a receptacle and as good a transmitter, as good a carer as they can be in order to help use their energy for the benefit of others. Maybe you would like to comment on that at some point.
It's a really good picture. David, you wanted to bring in on that?
No, you may remember when I opened the conference last night, I asked, what is the relationship, or put out the question, what's the relationship between consciousness and energy? And of course, consciousness is also notoriously difficult to define, and so is energy. And as we were talking just now, it occurred to me that in both cases, we've used a noun when we should probably be using a verb. And the reason I say that is that all the words we use to express this and try and describe what we're talking about are verbs like flow, balancing, blocking, and so on. It implies a flowing of something, whatever that is, whatever it is we're talking about. And maybe the word itself should be thought of in terms of a verb process rather than a substantive, which is our legacy from Aristotle.
Right.
I'd just like to take that idea of David's a bit further, because I see the energy from the point of view of pathology, and I think if one sees it that way, one can distinguish certain components to it. If you take a patient with Parkinson's, they can't initiate movement. In the early stages of Parkinson's, you can think clearly, but you can't initiate movement. You can't turn over in bed. And if you say to them, what's the problem? They say they don't have the energy to turn over. It's a sort of muscular lack of energy. Then if you take somebody after a motorcycle accident, when they have frontal lobe damage, they have another sort of lack of energy. And there's the motivational energy. they're perfectly able to move and get up and run about the gym, but they don't want to. They sit there. They can't motivate themselves. So it's a lack of another type of energy. Then you get the emotional energy spectrum, where you get the race for activity with the hypomanias, the fact that mood is driving you. Then mood drives you very fast, or you get the reverse, and in depression, then of course everything shuts down. The movement shuts down, the thinking shuts down, the feeling shuts down. There's a lack of energy in that dimension. So one's got the motivational energies, one's got the movement energies, one's got the mood energies. Then on top of that, I think that one has a totally different form of energies, which are the spiritual energies. And these are the energies which I see as energies which are opening up and removing the individual component of the self, and, if you like, the energies which are removing limitations within you and your relationships. So a sort of physiological view of energy.
So what I get out of that is that all these things are capacities for action, sources of action.
Absolutely.
And so what we're looking at is the different sources of actions in the person.
Yes.
And the way in which these sources of action can come up and down. And maybe that also includes some of the informational ideas. Does that make sense for people? Are we okay with sources for action? Does that make sense, or is it?
Could I perhaps ask people with more experience of different subtle energies? When you put up your marvellous list, I mean, I've been looking for that list for a long time. Very nice. The conserved quantity. It was very interesting. Is that for a long time science didn't know what it was looking for. There was this mysterious thing that kept cropping up, this conserved quantity, momentum, and then it came up with a mechanical equivalent of heat and so on that came up in electricity. And this, it was behind the scenes. It was just something implied, and it was always the same, but they didn't know what to call it. And then finally they realised that it existed in all these different forms, and it was always the same, and you could move it from one, and it was always conserved. So it could be electricity, it could be heat, it could be sound, it could be all sorts of things. Now, is there a subtle energy equivalent of this? I mean, could we approach that in the same kind of way, where we've got lots of different apparent things, but there's something behind all that, behind what we can describe, and maybe they can be converted somehow one into another, or am I completely out to lunch? Yeah.
Any offers? Conversion of energy?
I will attempt that from a non-scientific point of view, simply because of limitations of energy of understanding it. And I would just like to suggest here that I'm sure it is and will be possible when we have the apparatus and the comprehension, the motivation and the resources so to do. But there is also the question of exactly what are we attempting to measure. After all, we're having difficulty here defining the word energy. So if we're having difficulty with that, then it's going to be quite difficult developing a format sufficient to satisfy the scientific world that we're actually researching something which is quantifiable. Subtle energy, I think, is another term which is somewhat elusive. It suggests to me that it is difficult to locate, hence the word subtle, and refers to the minutiae of energy and understanding at a conscious level, probably at the exclusivity of Homo sapiens, but not necessarily so. So it's going to demand a very difficult definition for research purposes, but at some point, let us hope it will be attainable. The alternative, perhaps, is to have a belief system which just says this is so. It may satisfy many people. Indeed, in the realms of religion, there has always been a place for it. But whether it is sufficient in this particular era, or indeed in future eras, to rely on a belief system as explanation, perhaps is yet another poser for the listeners and ourselves to discuss.
I certainly get very worried when people start trying to quantify things, start rushing into things to quantify them when we don't really understand what it is that we're talking about in the first place. I would very much like to keep that sort of quantification away from it until we're a bit clearer what it is. But without quantifying it, might there be some trade-off between these different sorts of energy that we're talking about, or are they entirely separate? Because lots of the speakers have talked about different sorts of energy. I think you talked about a spectrum, didn't you, from the gross to the subtle. And a lot of people seem to be talking about a continuity between these different sorts, which suggests that sort of one can somehow flow into the other. Jill, can you?
Right. I was going to say, I think perhaps we need to ask ourselves what it is.
We can hear, but it's strange.
Right.
Could they turn the microphones up? Because this one seems particularly dead. I tell you what.
As we all move near the table,
I think one can simply take the microphones. Can you hear that okay?
Much better.
Okay, well, why don't we just speak into the microphone?
That's easier said than done.
There you are, Jim.
Thank you very much. I think perhaps one of the questions we need to ask ourselves is, what is it that differentiates energy? And I, for my way of looking at the universe, feel that the fields of information that are part of the divine mind which we're journeying in are the ideas or entities that differentiate energy, and we in our own way are transformers of energy, and I think the way that we do that depends very much upon our consciousness. So I think consciousness and energy, that very intimate relationship, is something that we can all personally experience in a way towards our journey of understanding what it means in a much greater sense. But I think we need to be looking at what it is that differentiates the way that energy is expressed.
I think it'd be good to get the audience interacting with this at this stage. So if we could, the people with roving mics could start producing them. There's one back there, and I think a hand went up pretty rapidly over there. Mr. Wong there, just behind you there.
Let me say a very humble word about the clear energy. One word. Energy actually consists of course, number 1 and 2, physical energy and spiritual energy. In addition to that, we got the extra energy, vital force, and then we can say the universal force and very divine force, the God energy. So whatever we talk, we all, in this world or in this whole universe, we live with energy. So energy, in a sense of, in medical field, I'm doing medical energy. So to the medical energy to heal. So according to the physician, we're going to trace the other side. You got vital force for the physical force. Actually,
can you speak into the microphone?
Oh, sorry. It is a physical force and also spiritual force. And also in that energy consists of quality and quantity, and plus also healing and also vital force. It includes most of our living organisms. So that's why we are living. So in the case of like homeopathy, like our healer, they all consist of the healing capacity of the energy. So we all talking energy. At the end, we are talking about two energy, physical energy and spiritual energy.
So you want to separate two different sorts, and you also want to...
We don't separate because both are go together. Okay. Whatever people is ill in a physical sense. Okay. If the physical sense want to recover, we need healer. So that's even now in hospital, healer are going to the hospital to heal. One that mentally become alert, and then cancer cure. And many diseases cure through the vital energy that is given by the God. God is actually the pure, the highest source of energy. It is in the full perfection. So no other energy can compare with that. So we call that the universal force or energy of perfection. It consists of love, light, and power, or all the beyond this world, and it goes into the whole universe. That's why the vital force of the divine force is a much more highest than any other, so it's called perfection of force, of energy.
Right, I'll take that as a comment, I think, rather than a question.
Sorry.
It was useful, and I like the stress on the qualitative aspect as well as the quantitative aspect. I think that was useful. Can we come to you at the front there? Alan.
I liked the last definition you put up on the board. This is the potential for change and action. I think that expresses pretty well all the senses in which we're using the word energy. Now, the way I would view it, I wouldn't necessarily say that all forms of energy are interchangeable, but I think that in a certain sense these different forms of energy are analogous to each other. And I think it would be very useful if in the future scientists and the rest of us could explore that analogy, that might give us further insights into the interrelations between these different types of energy. Now, just to give one example, to me, the concept of mental energy is a very good example of this, because the more mental energy a person has, the more that a person is able to achieve effective change and action. And furthermore, to me, mental energy is something very tangible and perceptual. I can perceive when I'm almost lacking in mental energy and just about ready to drop off to sleep, one end of the scale. I can also perceive when I have an unusual burst of alertness, ideas flood into my head. I can think of all sorts of different things. I can write easily, be very creative. This is when I have an exceptional surge of mental energy. That's the other end of the scale. And doubtless in the case of mystics, this analogy carries even higher. Their total awareness and surge of energy is even higher than that. So I think this gives us some areas which we can think about. And finally, I just wanted to refer to what David said about whether it was a verb rather than a noun. Now, I think it is both myself, because when the physicists quantify energy, clearly when energy is viewed in a quantitative way, it's a noun. But I think David is absolutely right. One has to think in terms of a process which is associated with the quantity as well.
Any comments on this so far, I think? Or shall we carry on with the audience? Other points from the audience. It's, lots of hands on that side. Julian, can you? Can we have a microphone on that side over there?
It was just a small puzzle of mine, really. Healers speak about healing energy and about channeling energy towards the client, the patient. This energy seems to have curative qualities of itself. Channeling, being able to transfer energy to the patient is sufficient to cure them. It's non-specific energy which has natural healing properties, and yet it seems very different to a volcano erupting. And I'm still struggling, as perhaps we all are, with trying to join these two ends of the spectrum. I'm also puzzled about vibration. Vibration to me means just shaking, and yet the word comes up so often, both in the physicist's language and also the healer's language. But vibration is just shaking, is it not?
Can I just say a quick word in answer to that? The question of healing energy, I think, is an excellent one. And if Arthur Ellison was here, he would point out the experiments that he'd done with healers. You know, when healers hold their hands over the healee usually feels warmth. And what Arthur showed in his experiments was quite clearly that it was the expectation of the individual that produced the feeling of warmth. In other words, you only felt the warmth when you knew the healer was there, and if other people were there, then you didn't feel the warmth. Now that, I think, is enormously important, because what it shows is that our concept of energy as something radiating out is probably not correct. But what is correct is it's the total situation of the healer and the healee together. So it's the consciousness of the situation. But we don't have to use a rather mechanical, and if I may go to just echo your word, Paul, the rather single-minded worldview that we have. We seem to have this, you've got to give me something. It's got to be transferred in a very physical way. I don't think it's like that, and I think the evidence suggests it's probably not like that, but it's the gestalt of the whole healing situation.
Can I attempt to add to the useful remarks just made? I think it's important to distinguish between the word cure and healing properties. It is not very wise of any healer to make grandiose claims that they can cure, but certainly that they can assist in the healing process. That is really quite important distinction. If cure is significant, then one accepts that with gratitude, but there certainly should not be any claims as to cure, or indeed for diagnosis for that matter. The other point that I think is worth considering in the word vibration is that this again is yet an example of attempting to give an explanation to either a feeling, a sensation, an intuition. We don't always find the right words, but we are constrained by the limit of our vocabulary in any given decade of time.
Can we go back to the audience? Half the audience have their hands up, I'm afraid. I don't know whether we have a microphone. Yes, right.
I've got the microphone.
So right.
What I'd like to say is that in my experience, and I come from an experiential field, all that you've been saying about energy is correct, but I would go on beyond to look at the larger concept. I don't think we're looking at this with enough dimensions. We know, the scientists know the relationship of the Earth to the Sun and the energy that is coming in from our solar power. We were hearing about it this morning, that actually feeds the Earth. And the dynamic of the magnetic fields which are actually emanating life force out of the planet and around the planet. Now, I believe, and from the work that we do, that the exit and entry points are actually very important places, and they are very much more common than we would normally acknowledge. I also believe that they actually mix energy into a 1,000 different variations and actually harmonize it and spread it around the contours of the globe. Basically, all the local areas are all harmonized. Now, the problem is that in the last 50 to 100 years, we've certainly done a tremendous amount with our own technology to change the contours of the land, and we've actually changed the dynamic under which a lot of these energies are mixed. I think we have changed the whole concept of energy by the very fact that energy originally would have altered the emotional state, will have altered consciousness, will have been part of our personality, and it works both ways. Our personality and our emotion actually alter energy states as well. The difficulty is to know how many people to bring together into one place, and how much money actually, and how serious people are actually going to take the situation that we're facing today. I think the issues that have been brought up today are absolutely fantastic. I mean, they really spell out the urgency of what we're doing. How on earth are we going to get this whole huge concept into one university and start working on it? Because, you know, I believe the planet urgently needs it. I come from a farming background and have lived with these energies that have been in memory banks placed there over 28,000 years. I was aware of those as a child and was told my imagination would get me into trouble one day. That's certainly doing that. That's certainly doing that now this evening. But
can we sort of pause and get a response on that?
Yes, certainly.
Maybe from you, Paul. It sounds a bit like Earth energies and the nature of the land and the interaction between people and the land. Does that ring any bells with you? No?
Yeah, I think I take that as a very personal view. There's certainly energies in the land, there's no question at all. They're measurable. You can pick up a gravity map of a landscape, magnetic maps. I mean, they're produced. You can actually see the contours. If you look at the Bala Fault between Barmouth and Harlech, for example, the Mokras Fault that links almost those two places, the strength of gravity is different on either side of that fault, and they've done it in bright colours. It's a very distinctive thing. and the magnetism changes. So I mean, it is a fact that there are energies in the planet, in the Earth's crust, and the stuff cascading down, and secondary particles, and all the rest of it. And there's also can be no doubt that things that we are doing, because we're having a big impact on the planet, will to some extent change that. And I think when we talk about environmental problems and pollution and things, as Joan was doing this morning, I think we also have to take into account that invisible environment also, the changes we're making to that. And I mean, I have no great thoughts about it. The one thing you said about that we need to... I have a big problem with ideas of healing the Earth, because I don't think the Earth needs healing. I think we've got to heal ourselves. The Earth exists at the moment in a very handy form for us to live here. And if we screw that up, we won't live here anymore. But the Earth has got the ages that belong to it to develop another life form or not, as it chooses. So it's our healing that's the issue. And so if we screw up that environment so we can no longer stay here, then the problem corrects itself. It's a hard view, but it's pragmatically true.
Yeah. I'm aware that the bar closes in about 10 minutes' time, so perhaps if we could take another couple of questions. Can we have someone over on this side? Because I think I've been giving people a bit of a shout. The person in blue there, perhaps.
Thank you. Would it be correct to view energy as a holistic system, by which I mean that the whole is greater than the sum of the individual parts or different variations, but the depletion of any one of those parts depletes the whole? For example, we have talking about healing energy and spiritual healing, but it may not be that healing is required on that level, but on the subtle energy level, because the person is living in an electromagnetic smog or something like that. So it is not a thing, but it is a holistic system of interacting variations. Could you comment on that, please?
I think most of them probably go along with that. Perhaps a last comment from the front there, and I think probably after that we ought to let the conversation carry on in the bar. There are lots of people who would like to carry on.
Yes, I'd like to make a brief comment and then a quick question. I was a little surprised what Peter mentioned about the experience of heat being dependent upon the subjective expectation of the individual. My own experience in working with heart energies, if you have two individuals sitting opposite each other with no physical contact, and you invite them to extend the heart energy out towards a central point, and then after a while invite them to pull the energy back, and if you ask them about the experience, what you tend to hear is the word heat and the word cold coming up. When the heart energies join, heat is commonly experienced, and when the heart energy is pulled away, cold. So that's just my experience. I'm rather surprised to hear that. The other question is, it's a very burning issue with a project I'm currently developing, and it's to do with ley lines and energy lines. I am hearing conflicting viewpoints about whether ley lines are actually to do with the Earth's geometric what have you, or if they're to do with thought form. I have been told by one person working in the field that with sacred sites, these energy lines or ley lines are created by human thought form. I don't know if there may be different things. Have we got perhaps ley lines and energy lines as two separate things? It's an area I'd very much appreciate clarification on.
So can we just take sort of responses to those 2 points and then close?
It'd be best if I at least kicked off on that one.
Right.
As you know, I've been behind the lay hunter deaths for 20 years for my sins. Ley lines is not a word. I mean, nobody ever used that word till the 60s. We know where it started. And Alfred Watkins, who coined the term lays, was referring to old straight traders' tracks. And it never meant anything else. When he died in 1935, 1936, Dion Fortune wrote a novel called The Goatfoot God, where she suggested that these lines were lines of force, of occult power. 1938, a man called Arthur Lawton associated that concept with the concept of geopathological dowsings going on in Germany and France, and the various grids that were beginning to emerge in various systems as they saw it. And he said it could be dowsed. He was the first man to put the whole bit together. And all that mercifully died a short of death in the 40s and 50s, but it was dug up again, disinterred in the 60s. And I've never heard so much garbage in my life as emerged in that decade. It got mixed in with feng shui, and we were all tripping out. We all had our psychedelic shirts on and everything. I was full up to with it. But I can only tell you that what we now know. I mean, this literature's been out for 8 years on this now, and ley lines don't exist. But the idea of linear features in the landscape are archaeological features. They're actual marks on the landscape. The Nazca lines are a famous example, but we have many more. I was going to flash through about 20 shots when the carousel blew up. So there we go. We've been. I've been tracing lines now in the Americas for some time. They are aspects of shamanic landscapes, and they are associated with the non-locality of consciousness. And we finally confirmed this with the Kogi Indians in Colombia. And because we found the lines, we found the ethnology of the people who lived in the landscapes where those lines were, and we were pretty sure that it was a sort of spirit geography, if you like. Geoglyphs and effigy mounds are part of shamanic landscapes also. And we figured it was a modelling of the landscape in terms of seeing it with the disembodied, the shaman in his aerial journey, and the dissociated state. But we couldn't actually do it until Alan Herrera's experience of filming the Kogi Indians, and we were then able to ask practicing shamans, are there pathways, physical traces of mental or spirit lines, whatever language you want to use. In their case, it's called a lunar. And the answer was yes, it was. So that's what ley lines are. They are the heritage of human consciousness. Energy lines, most of it is total tosh, because you can trace where the ideas come from. Why is the Paia grid different to the Hartman grid or the Curry net and so on? It's very Germanic stuff that got mixed in with this, and then it got churned up by the Americans who picked it up in about 1972, was in fact the year they picked it up. It went round the New Age circuit, and it went to Findhorn, then we had silly booklets produced by them, and this sort of stuff came out, and it was an endless corridor of mirrors. I have a simple test, and it's a dowsing test, of anybody if they can dowse energy. Now, you can dowse energy. There's no two ways about that. Dowsing is a human faculty. But the idea of there being energy lines, some force that you can dowse running for miles between sites, does not exist. It's a modern myth. And it occurred, I've just finished here, but it arose. It's a fascinating sociological phenomenon, because it arose exactly at the time when all those little transistor radios were appearing, the solid state circuitry was appearing. It was the mirror image of that technology that was occurring. So the idea of energy lines in the landscape, to me, is a techno-mechanical concept of the mid to late 20th century. I abhor the concept of there being the Earth's body being sort of a circuit board for sort of energies that we project onto it. And because we've been projecting for 20 years, we did not hear what the Earth and what the people, primary peoples who lived here before us, were actually telling us. We jammed the signal. So I think it's terribly important that we separate out where all these ideas finally came from. And merged into this sort of image we now have, which is a modern myth. There's nobody working in the field who believes this anymore. It is generated by a sort of New Age circus, and I pick up books that actually make statements about this in, say, 1989. Statements are made that I know were invented by people in a pub in 1968, and I know the pub. But it is repeated again as a fact. And now we have a generation of people working with this material who don't know the origins of it. I've even had Aborigines coming to staying in my home, lovely, lovely person, but thinks that trying to explain her ideas of tribal law in terms of energy grids. And I said, do Aborigines have energy grids? And she said, well, no, not really. We have winds from the earth. I said, well, use your language. She said, but I was trying to make you understand what I meant. And in fact, you've got a reverse anthropology going on. So this whole thing needs breaking down. So the answer is no, no, and no.
That's hugely valuable. Thank you. Can we end with a last word from Peter, just responding to that point about heat?
Naomi, it's not as simple as that. You gave a lovely experiment where you said you had two people and you said, let's extend the heart energies. And when my heart energy touches your heart energy, then I feel a feeling of warmth. And when it's withdrawn, there's a feeling of coldness. It's a lovely experiment, and that's exactly what I'm talking about. It's the gestalt of the situation. But if you want to test it, it has to be something quite different from that. First thing you have to do is to have people who have no expectation of what they're going to find. Okay. And then you have to do it so that they're blinded to it. By that I mean the person has to extend the energy when the other person isn't doing it and they don't know what the other person is doing. So it's quite blind. And you'll find that when you do it blinded, then the effect disappears. In other words, the effect is part of the relationship between two people. It's not a passive transference. So in the situation where you are both expecting things to occur, they occur. They're very real effects. I mean, it goes back to the placebo effect again. Well,
I don't want to get into a...
Yes, no, I don't want to either.
Thanks for that clarification, anyway.
Okay,
I'll
leave
really
it there.
must stop now because it's 11 o'clock and I think we ought to come to an end. Thank you all, audience, very much for participating.
Thank you.